Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. For those of you who are new to my channel, we welcome you. Please consider subscribing as well as hitting that bell notification icon to stay a part of a growing and thriving podcast community. Today's guest in the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder is none other than my colleague and friend, Dr. Mo Hannah. Dr. Mo Hannah is an experienced psychologist. She's experienced her own, loss and traumatic loss, but she's also a profound healer and has a lot of different cutting-edge techniques and that I'd like for you to share, that she's going to share with us today on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. And I was honored and fortunate enough to cross paths with her presenting at the Forever Family Foundation, which many of you are familiar with from watching Surviving Death, as well as one of my first interviews with its co-founder, Bob Ginsberg. Without further ado, we bring on Dr. Mo Hannah here on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Dr. Mo Hannah, thank you for being an honored guest here on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. It's just a pleasure to have you on my channel today.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's great being here.
Yeah, for my viewers who are not aware, we have roots that go far back with the Forever Family Foundation. I know I recently saw you again in the April retreat, and I, as always, am blown away by your work and was significantly impacted by one of your workshops with the EMDR techniques, which hopefully we'll discuss. But for my viewers who are not necessarily aware of your work, could you maybe just kind of give like a short synopsis of your work and maybe what brought you to your work? Because to me, it is profound, and what led you to it is deeply touching and inspiring as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. This is a little bit more of a complex question than just how I was brought to the work of the Forever Family Foundation, which I will say just parenthetically, sort of kicking and screaming, okay, as some of us are brought to certain, pursuits in life that we would not necessarily choose, but that life carries us there, or maybe spirit carries us there, maybe God carries us there, who knows. But I found this to be a sort of a repeated pattern in my life. And I know this is true of many people, where certain things happen to us and we're faced with sort of a stark choice about what to do with it, right? So you go through a trauma, you go through an injustice, you go through a loss, and it can cripple you, it can destroy you, or you can do your best to use it, to rise above. I say you squeeze the juice out of the lemon. And for whatever reason, I've found myself doing that, having to do that at various points in my life. So I'm just going to back up for a little bit, because the work I do, and again, much of the work I do just sort of came to me as a result of life experiences. Not all of it. I'm a therapist. I've been a therapist my whole adult life. My father was a therapist, actually. My father was a marriage, family, and child therapist. Yet after a career in chemistry, believe it or not, he became a marriage, family, and child therapist. And I really don't believe, at least at the moment, I don't believe that I became a therapist because my father was a therapist. It wasn't really like that. It's just that somehow there was this shaping and this molding, right, that I was exposed to. And I think I came to this career. I think many of us, like you, were called to this career, just like physicians are called to their career and lawyers are called to their career and so forth. So I've found this to be a repeated pattern in my life, that I've been sort of shaped and molded by my experiences. Again, I'm not unique in this. I went through a number of experiences that sort of brought me to the point where I am now, and engaged me in the work that I do. So, for example, I'm a couples therapist. I'm a practicing psychologist, but one of my specialties is couples therapy. And again, my father was a couples therapist, and it's not like I wanted to be my father, but somehow that shaped and molded me. And I was exposed to an approach that some of your listeners may have heard of, which is it's a beautiful, what I call a psycho-spiritual approach. The psycho and the spiritual, the psychological and the spiritual, as I'm sure, like you, we're drawn towards that because psychology isn't enough, and we want to integrate the spirituality because they really are intertwined to such a large degree. But there's a psycho-spiritual approach to couples therapy called imago relationship therapy. And I was exposed to that sort of in a happenstance way by a couple that I was friends with who there was an affair involved in their relationship. And they came through that and introduced me as I was interacting with them, sort of in a supportive way. They came across imago relationship therapy. I became involved in imago relationship therapy, or I took a workshop in imago relationship therapy, became an imago relationship therapist, and then started working in the writing end, the publication of imago relationship therapy. And I still practice that approach to this day, but it's got a unique way of seeing couplehood as being a path for spiritual growth, as well as psychological healing. So there was that. And then as I moved through my life, and I was married, I had 4 children, and then I encountered, not to get into too many gory details, but I encountered some very personally challenging things in my marriage. I ended up going through a custody battle, and I would never have dreamed in my earlier life that I would ever go through something like that would ever become something that I would encounter or that I would need to encounter, but I did. And from going through that, and that was quite an ordeal and quite a traumatic one, I might say. And I really saw what was going on in that whole realm of life. And I'm not going to get into it now because this program is not really about that, but that's sort of another avenue that I became it's like a vortex, In imago therapy, we talk about the imago vortex. You get pulled into the work, Same thing with the experiences I had with custody battles. And so that led me, after I moved sufficiently through my own trauma from going through that led me to say, not enough is being done in this area. Why isn't there a conference about what people go through in these kinds of situations? So I started a conference called the Battered Mothers Custody Conference. That was back in 2004. I didn't want to start this conference. I don't know how this happened. It just sort of came across my lap, and then it coalesced in a lot of people, very, very good people that have been working on this issue certainly longer than I had been, came together, and we've held this conference now 16 times, so 16 annual conferences. The last one was this past April. So with Forever Family, so now that leads to Forever Family. So actually, I lost a child. I lost a baby at birth in 1988. Something that, again, you're not really prepared for that. I think losing a child is one of those things that nobody can prepare for. Okay, I mean, you can try to be prepared for it if you happen to know that it's going to occur, such as parents who have ill, children who are ill or have terminal illnesses. But this was a sort of a fluke that happened where my baby died at birth, and I went through that, and I think it contributed to my growth. But what really coalesced for me was when I lost my oldest child, Monique, in 2007 to suicide, which, the irony, of course, is that I am and was a mental health professional. I had been in the field as a psychologist, by that time, probably 15 years. Wow. So, it's that kind of thing. Well, if it can happen to me, right, it can happen to any parent. And it can, theoretically, it can happen to anybody. Certainly something that I never, ever dreamed could happen with this child. And nonetheless, it did happen. And when it happened, and I talk about this at the Forever Family Foundation Grief Retreat, I don't care how much you know as a psychologist, as a therapist, as anybody working in the mental health field, when you are faced with that type of loss, none of that stuff gels, really. None of it is enough. None of it prepares you. And I remember very distinctly when it happened, being so stunned and feeling so incompetent to deal with it and to recover. And so I had to almost reinvent myself and almost reinvent my mental health and my way of approaching life and my way of moving, putting one foot in front of the other. I would never have chosen that path. It sort of got chosen for me. Okay. Parents who have lost children, when I say lost, I mean they passed on, right? Say we're in a club we would never want to belong to. It's one of those things. I know people say that about other kinds of experiences as well. So in the process of recovery, and just like with my custody battle and with, early experiences I had, I decided, literally it was a decision to squeeze the lemon juice out of the lemon and not let this defeat me. And that was the segue in a sense. And I also talk in my talk, because Forever Family Foundation grief retreats are very much oriented to the science of the afterlife. So they're not just about, let's make ourselves feel better, which of course that's part of it. Let's help ourselves cope with this awful experience called grief, the loss of a loved one. And by the way, at the Forever Family Foundation retreats, it's not only about the loss of a child, it's about the loss of any loved one. So people that come for the grief retreat, there's a variety of losses, but many, many people, a good portion of the people who come have lost children, because it's such an unbearable loss for so many of us. Okay. So what I share at the grief retreat is simply how I recovered. The little nitty gritty of practices, the way you think, the way you hold yourself, the way you manage your emotions, the way you get through your day, the way you maintain hope, the way you pray for this experience to enlarge you rather than cause you to constrict and shrink up. Okay. Which so many of us do. What you feel like doing is you feel like going into the corner and staying in a fetal position. When I work with people who are bereaved, I get it. And that's probably, part of the plus. I get it. If I were to work with clients who have lost a child and I hadn't had that experience myself, I think I could be supportive, but I don't think I could be truly compassionate, because it takes one to know one. Right? So that's what's led me to the work that I do now. And like I said, in another life, I would have preferred that I hadn't lost my child, at the age of 20 to suicide. But there was a book that I published after she passed with colleagues on the domestic violence. One of my specialty areas is domestic violence. And I did a tribute to Monique, and I said, and this remains true to this very day, she has taught me more in the time that she's been gone than I taught her in the 20 years she was with me.
Wow. So a lot certainly to unpack. I learned so much from what you just said, as always. But for my viewers, it certainly seems like grief does not have to always be morose, that there could be a purpose and a growth behind it. And you were able to have this abyss of an experience on the surface that was not your fault. And what you came out of it was a different perspective and an ability to interact with clients in a profoundly new way. Obviously, we would rather have it that she is still here, but it's something that we walked into and out of our control. For my clients who may be going through their own grief, what would you say is some of the most helpful pieces of information you've gathered personally and professionally to, again, maybe allow someone to go from, let's say a victim of loss to be a victor, in their experience, like you have in your own profound way, and the development of resilience that you've had throughout this and so many other experiences that you just discussed in our short time here?
Yeah. Well, one thing that comes to mind is necessity is the mother of invention. So I was, again, this is something I talk about at the grief retreat. in a way, I was lucky and privileged that I had to recover. Okay. So that motivation is part of it, that compulsion. I had 3 younger children. They were all, teenagers at the time. And I was a single mother. So part of it, there's many bricks in the wall, right? So one of the bricks in the wall is that feeling of exigency. It's also, it's interesting because, again, our lives go in patterns, and I've noticed these patterns. So I had this, when I went through the marital breakdown and the custody battle, there was an exigency to it. There was I felt compelled, morally, spiritually compelled to make sure I did my best, that things turned out the way that they should. Okay. So there was part of that. It was that compulsion. I talked to parents who, they will say, thank God I have other children. Some parents who lose a child don't have other children. Okay. So that piece for them is missing. So I was in some ways blessed. I also, as I talk about at the grief retreat, I was blessed. I was privileged. Like any of us can. Okay. This is not just me. I'm nobody special. I'm nobody special. I'm an average human being, in my opinion. I'm an average human being that happened across these experiences and had to respond to them. But I began to get signs. I began to get messages,
Wow.
and those were incredibly impactful. And, you've probably heard it at the grief retreat. I talk about this, the Netflix series. It's very interesting how the Netflix series, and I don't want to get too much into that if you ever want to explain that to your viewers, what that's about. But the Netflix series that talks about, it's called Surviving Death, and the Forever Family Foundation grief retreat had clips in it. And I happened to be in one of those clips. Actually, what I say is my daughter was in those clips. Monique was in those clips. Yeah, she was in there. She was an actress. That was her chosen field. She was at NYU studying acting when she passed. And, in the grief retreat, I talk about this. The first message I got, even as somebody who didn't really believe in an afterlife at the time, first message I got, it was very clear, and it was very brief, and it was very distinct. Waking up in the morning with this message in my mind, so I couldn't have thought it myself. It kind of came to me, like, we talk about downloads. It was kind of a download.
Wow.
You have to change your state of consciousness. You have to change your state of consciousness. That's the message I got. And that was sort of like the guiding principle. What does that mean, really? For me, what does that mean? So that message really began to guide me, and I began to search. And that's one of the ways that I came across the Forever Family Foundation, because I was searching for ways to recover, for ways to heal, for ways to endure. And so that guided me towards all sorts of experiences, and probably like many people do, I've talked to so many people who have, lost loved ones, and those who have this kind of sort of a spiritual orientation, or at least open to a spiritual orientation. So I became that message opened me to a spiritual orientation, right? It opened me up. And we read books because, by that time, 2007, there was sort of like a burgeoning explosion of material on the afterlife, and Raymond Moody's work. Of course, his work had been out for quite a while, but there was so much available. I was like astonished when I started opening up to this material to see how much had been published, and really in relatively recent times. Okay, in the 1990s and the 2000s and so forth. And now it's like there's a plethora of books, such as your books and the books that people from Forever Family have written, and Bob Ginsberg has written about the medium explosion. And so we know so much more now than we did even, 17 years ago now, when Monique passed. So the reading just, I used to wear headphones most of the day and night with audio books, spiritual books, healing books, all the great authors in this field talking about near-death experiences, so that I could understand, where did she go? Because every parent wants to know that. Every parent wants to know where their child is.
Wow.
And when they pass, you want to know where your child is. That's your first question. Where did she go? Is she okay?
Yeah.
Any parent. Ask anybody who's lost a loved one. Is he okay? Is she okay? And so again, that became part of my quest. And I learned that absolutely she is okay through all the experiences that I had, the workshops I went to, the Forever Family stuff that I went to, the things that I learned through that organization and many other organizations.
Yeah.
I happen to live in an area, I'm in upstate New York. People think upstate New York is anything north of New York City, but there's a lot more upstate than just north of New York City. So I'm outside of Albany, and even Albany is pretty much in the center of the state. So it's upstate, but there's a lot more upstate. But I'm outside of Albany, and there's a spiritual teaching center called Omega Institute.
Yep.
That is an easy drive for me. It's about an hour and maybe an hour and a half at most. And so I began to attend things at Omega. They've got, world-class teachers at Omega.
I'll be there presenting next October. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yes, it's a great place. It's a great place. And so they bring together many, many, many teachers.
Yeah.
So
Rhinebeck. Yeah.
In Rhinebeck, yeah. So I was able to go to their presentations there and various other workshops and stuff. And just pulling it all together, and I kind of wove it together into sort of a fabric, And the other thing, of course, the other tool that was extremely potent for me, and this is for me, okay, but was meditation. So meditation, again, I talk about this at the retreat. There's all these little coincidences that are not coincidences, because as we say, there are no coincidences, but it's something I share at the retreat, but I'll just mention it here, is when I was in college, I learned to meditate. Okay. I went to college in Tucson, Arizona, and it was a very kind of a spiritual kind of Renaissance place, back when I was going to college. And, so there was a lot going on. There was a lot of yoga ashrams and things like that. So I kind of became involved in those types of things. And then I put it all aside, once I got into, graduate school and being married and having kids, I had put all that aside. But I had meditated. I learned transcendental meditation when I was in college, and had put that aside as well, but had practiced it in my younger years. And when Monique she was depressed for about 4 months before she took her life. And I had been, of course, turning myself inside out to help her and to keep her alive and to help her, to cope and to help her to heal and so forth. And some things happened in the context of that probably are beyond this interview, but so we won't have to get into it. But what I did do is I was very worried about my own mental health and my own physical health when I was going through that with her. Besides, I was also a professor and had, a full client practice, and I had my other children, and I was helping my daughter, who was a college sophomore at the time, desperately helping her within a mental health system that is extremely inadequate. Okay, I will say that. I say, do not trust your depressed, suicidal child to the mental health system. Okay, that's what I would say. But I was so worried about her, and it was really tearing me up so much that I said, I've got to do something to help myself. And I suddenly remembered meditation. And I remembered I had a mantra. I remembered my mantra. Okay. So I got a refresher, you can, with TM, you can go back, you can get a refresher and just start your meditation practice again. So I started to do that. And a week later, my daughter took her life. So I had just started that practice. And that was the practice I needed when she passed to begin my recovery. Okay, so it just was in place for me, And so I found meditation to be one of the most potent avenues toward getting your mind to calm down, getting your thoughts to subside, and making contact. And the mediums will tell you this, and I'll talk about IADC in a minute, but when I was trained in induced after-death communication, which also came about sort of coincidentally, what I was told by Al Botkin, who developed IADC, is that when people meditate, they open themselves up to more contact with their deceased loved one. The mediums talk about that. The mediums who presented Forever Family, who are very highly skilled mediums, as you know. These are extraordinary people. These are not average mediums. These are tested, tried and true mediums. And they say pretty much the same thing, that there's something about meditation and how that affects your brain waves and how that affects your frequency, that you're able to more easily make contact. And no guarantees. There's no guarantees about making contact with the spirit world, as we know, but meditation does help. So that is another component that I would recommend to people. I know it's difficult, especially for the Western mind, okay, but it's a very, very good practice, both for just self growth, self healing, but also for opening up to contact, which is really the Forever Family Foundation it's dedicated to the science of the afterlife, to promoting an understanding of the science of the afterlife. And there is a lot of science out there, as you know, and also to helping people to open up and develop a way of making contact with their deceased loved ones. And I talk to a lot of people who attend the retreat, and even people who don't attend the retreat, who say that they absolutely feel they can have some degree of contact. Not everybody by any means. But again, that is the drive that you feel, especially losing a child, but losing anybody that you loved. We're still connected through love, but we want to really feel that connection. Experience is key. As you know, experience is everything.
Yeah, that direct experience. And you know, our language is so significant in how we connect to loved ones. I mean, just the word death itself means a complete ending. And so it's almost just counterintuitive to feel, hey, with a complete ending, there's a continual relationship. But even like as you were just saying, that we walk around saying, hey, I lost a loved one. And in one sense, that may, be a part of this journey. But if we know where they are, how could they be lost in a way?
Exactly.
And it seems for you, and so for many in the foundation, through going to a medium or having their own direct experience, that they're able to have an understanding that they are somewhere, that they are okay. That doesn't change the human reaction to grief, but incorporates spiritual understanding. And I think that was so beautifully said, in your own grief journey. I saw, IADC in front of me when you were there, and I saw a participant, that was able to deeply connect. So I could certainly attest to it. But yeah, I think we put a lot of emphasis, and people could help us connect. But like you said, we and many other mediums in the foundation said we have the ability to connect on our own, and that's profound, on the grief journey. Do you feel that spirituality is one of the missing emphasis within grief counseling and grief processing? Is that a missing essential link, or could you still go through grief and be, and transform and not have that spiritual existential transformation?
Yeah. Well, I couldn't. Okay, I couldn't. I do a lot of this work out of my own personal experience, as well as my reading and, my exposure to, the people who work in the grief field. And I think spirituality, that awareness, in a way, is a little bit of a gift. Okay, it's something that we come across and it resonates. And if it doesn't resonate for you, it doesn't resonate for you. Before Monique passed, I was raised Catholic, okay? Like so many people raised Catholic, and they're like, oh man, I'm not going to do that anymore. Although I feel like I gained a great deal from an appreciation of the sacred. And all of that came back to me, not the Catholicism per se, but the appreciation of the sacred after Monique passed and while I was on my journey. So can you recover without a sense of spirituality? Like I said, I couldn't. I couldn't. I had to rediscover that spirituality in a new form, with new language. And and I was fortunate enough to have access to material. I talk about this also at the grief retreat. One of the little anecdotes I share is when my daughter was depressed, and again, I could go into the whole mental health treatment model that I now, feel is not the right model. But back then, and she was going through, she was going through treatment, and she was hospitalized at one point because she had had an attempt. That's what you do, right? When people have an attempt. And I was so desperate to help her. So I thought, okay, maybe she'll read. Maybe she'll read some self-help literature. Maybe she'll read some spiritual literature. And she was an avid reader. She was an artist. She was a very, very intelligent young woman. And so I went to a bookstore when they had bookstores back then. I mean, they still have some bookstores. I went to a bookstore. I go into like the psychological section. I go into the spiritual section because I wanted to inspire her. I wanted her to maybe find something to cling to. So I picked up some books and I was amazed, because I hadn't really looked at that stuff in a while. I was amazed at the stuff about the afterlife and NDEs and all that stuff. I thought, okay, I'll get some of these things for her. Picked up a book. Most of your listeners would know this name, Eckhart Tolle. I picked up Eckhart Tolle's first book, his bestseller called The Power of Now.
Wow.
He later wrote A New Earth.
A New Earth, yeah.
A New Earth, yeah. So I got The Power of Now, and I looked through and I thought, wow, this sounds really interesting. If she could read this and absorb this, maybe this would help her to cope. So I brought her all these books at the hospital. I brought it over and had it delivered, and I would visit her at the hospital and so forth. But anyway, after she passed, I had all of her belongings and I had those books, and it was probably about 5 or 6 books. And I look at these books and I realized these books were for me. Mm-hmm. They were for me. They were what I needed at that point in my journey. And so I began to read these books. And one of those books, as I said, there was some great stuff. There was, the afterlife experiments and stuff like that. But one of them was The Power of Now. And that really, really helped me to hang on, mm-hmm. That material helped me, that way of seeing, that way of being in the world, that way of being present, that way of living really helped me to hang on, and then of course I read a lot of his other work and so forth. So I really recommend his books. Eckhart Tolle books are basically, he says the exact same thing in about 500 different ways. That's it.
Yeah. And again, I know I just had Neil Donald Walsh. I don't know if you're familiar with him, author of Conversations with God.
Yep.
On my channel for the second time. But yeah, he and Eckhart and a lot of spiritual teachers have different circumstances, but an existential crisis. Even the Buddha himself, their transformation was birthed out of crisis, and sometimes from losing yourself in the world that you find anew, and I do find that trajectory is possible. We wish it was another way where we would be able to just have all the good things in our life and still transform, and you can, but it just seems like, to thrive and survive, a different way of being, a different way of seeing the world, like you said, was essential. But the power of now is so pivotal. I had someone who, sadly was on his way to cross over. I never had this question posed to me before. And he said, I'm about to go. I'm a little bit scared. I know you know where I'm going. Can you tell me one thing? And I'm like, geez, I was so thrown off by the question. And I just said, just be here now. Just be in the moment. Because sometimes when we're so future oriented, there's an anxiety promotion and focus on another time frame. And from a near-death experience perspective, and I'm sure from your experiences, time is of the essence. We just have to live while we are living, over here and over there, and be fully in the moment, because our life depends on it. I believe our ability to be as full as we can in each moment. And I hope that was good advice. And since then, I've been connecting to this individual. So I'm so grateful you brought up the power of now, because that is so essential when suffering comes to the surface and we're going through crisis. Just finding ways to look at life through the sacred lens and not through, being fearful or scared of what's coming to us, and embracing the moment for the good or the bad.
Yeah. And the principles he talks about, which are very much interrelated, are being present and acceptance of the present, right? Being present and accepting the present. Okay. You don't have to accept the future. You don't have to accept the past. You just accept the now. You're present with it. But of course, acceptance of the past even is part of it. And, I also talk about this at the retreat, is when I had a sort of like began to kind of turn, hopefully in a better direction with my grief, was when I was able to accept what happened. Because to some degree, when something like that happens, and I've worked with a lot of people who are, quote, survivors of suicide, somebody in their sphere, somebody they love took their own life. That's a tough one, because there's always that part of our brain that says, I could have done something different. Why didn't I? Why couldn't I? Right? It's so easy to fall down that trap and get into that, obsessive rumination, right? And of course, for a parent who loses a child, it's the same thing, especially to suicide, but really any kind of loss. So staying present, when I was able to sort of get it, that, you stay in the moment, and all you have to do is live in the moment, because that's all we have. That's it. That's all we've got is this moment. That's why breathing is such a good exercise, because we can only breathe in the now. So staying in the now, it's really hard. It's really hard. But I found that when I was able to practice that, just going back to the moment, this moment, and accepting what is, right? Accepting things as they are. That was, I talk about how that helped me to turn around. And it's still a practice. I mean, this is not, it's practice makes perfect, but we're never going to be perfect at doing that kind of thing. It's always going to be a practice. We're always going to do it imperfectly, and that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I think what you just said was almost a short synopsis of that scene in Good Will Hunting, where a Robin Williams' client, Matt Damon, I believe, was just going through so much emotional trauma and turmoil, and he just kind of said, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault."
It's not your fault, right?
Gave him a big hug, and I think we all need to understand that, what people do is not our fault. We do the best we can to love them as much as we can, to give them most we can. But it seemed for yourself, removing that guilt of onus of responsibility and acceptance was pivotal on your journey. And I know so many of my viewers need to hear that message, myself included. I mean, I know a friend of mine crossed over to suicide, and I, again, was so obsessed with what could I've done. And then getting a medium reading where he came through very strongly, the first emphasis was to get rid of the guilt, to remove that he wants to say that it's not your fault. So thank you, obviously, for that. But regarding IADC, it almost, in meditation, almost reminds me kind of like Wizard of Oz scene, where it's just, you have the power in you all along to connect. And it's so beautiful. But for viewers, like, I know this is more extended, but what could you recommend them to practice to maybe connect their loved ones through meditation or IADC? What could they practically
What could they do?
do
So the saying is, or the belief is, or the general wisdom is, in the mediumship community, at least the ones that I've been exposed to, these really high level, skilled, talented mediums, say that we all have the capacity to connect, and different mediums teach different strategies to connect. Okay, so I'm speaking about this as a civilian. Okay, as a non-medium, we all have that capacity, and I think it's a matter of tapping into it and opening ourselves up. But certainly meditation is part of it. But the general wisdom, and then this is going to hook into IADC, so I'm going to talk about IADC as well, because I think your listeners will be interested in it, because boy, it was a real eye-opener for me. And it was again one of those things that came along my path coincidentally, by accident, sort of, right? By accident, that really transformed how I live and how I work, and also my grief. But again, the idea is to try to raise your frequency and to see really heavy grief, especially when we get stuck in anger, we get stuck in bitter. I talk about bitterness a little bit at the retreat. Bitterness is completely understandable. Sometimes life sucks. Sometimes things happen to us that just aren't fair. We can't figure out how this happened, and we can get so stuck on the injustice of it. And I get it. I understand that. But the frequency of those emotions, not that there's anything wrong with any emotions. They are what they are. But you don't want to get stuck in them, right? because it keeps you on that lower frequency level. All right. And we need to raise our frequency because spirit is vibrating at a higher frequency and we're vibrating at a lower frequency. And we're trying to meet somewhere in the middle. Okay. And even the mediums, they will describe it exactly that way. So to try to lift yourself up in any way you can. And I found meditation to be very helpful for that. If talking to people, if doing, traditional grief therapy helps you, that's fine. I personally, I started out with, desperately trying to find anything that would help me continue to breathe, and keep my feet on the earth. I didn't find traditional grief therapy. I just did a few sessions, but I didn't find it helpful myself. And then some people do say that. They say it just doesn't resonate for them. Some people do find it very helpful. Some people find going to grief groups very helpful. But what I found was one day I was listening. Again, I can't really even remember or know how I ended up listening at the right time. But I was listening to the Forever Family Foundation. They have a
radio show.
Show, and then they have webinars and stuff like that. So I was listening to the radio show. This was probably a couple of months after Monique passed. It was pretty soon afterwards. I stumbled across Forever Family somehow, and it was a real turnaround, of course, and extremely helpful, and it was operative in my recovery. But I was listening to the radio show, and Al Bakken was on there. Now, Dr. Al Bakken is a psychologist. And one of the things we have in common is we were both VA psychologists, Veterans Administration psychologists. So it was really intriguing. I'm listening to Al. He was a VA psychologist.
He's with Chicago, right?
Yeah, he was in the Chicago area. Yeah, he was in the Chicago area. He lives north of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And so he's talking about his work with veterans. And, I know who he's talking about because I work with these veterans. I mean, I know what kind of people they are. And it was wonderful working with these veterans. And he had a longer career at the VA than I did because I left the VA after a couple of years to teach college at Siena College in upstate New York. And he was talking about how he had been trained in EMDR in the early years, because EMDR hadn't been around that long when he got trained in EMDR. It was I think late 80s or early 90s, somewhere in there. And he was using EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's an evidence-based treatment now, a very powerful treatment, very good trauma treatment, okay? He was using it with the veterans, and he was discovering that these veterans were having these ADCs, these after-death communications, out of the blue. Now, Al is not a touchy-feely kind of guy, I can tell you that, okay? He was not a spiritual type. This just sort of happened, and he says, what is going on here? And he began to kind of study it and say, am I doing anything that is... These veterans are saying, I'm talking to this little Vietnamese girl that was killed because this child came under fire, or this woman that was murdered in a massacre in a village or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And these veterans were reporting these things, and he was astonished. And he discovered that there were certain little modifications he made to the EMDR technique, and he was getting pretty reliable results with people saying they were having these ADCs. So he began to train other VA psychologists in doing the EMDR in a sort of a modified way. And it's a little bit beyond our discussion today what that modification is, but it's a modified form of EMDR. So I heard him talking about that, and he was saying that, there's no guarantee you're going to have an ADC when you do this EMDR technique, which is now called induced after-death communication. He wrote a book about it called Induced After-Death Communication, his discovery and then his experiences with clients. He said with people in the general clinical population, he was getting closer to like 70% of people at the end of treatment were reporting some type of ADC. With the veterans, it was more in the 90% area. So there was something about working with the veterans and something about maybe the attitude that the veterans had, or maybe there was fewer expectations on the part of the veterans, because that expectation can be problematic. It's like when you want a sign, they come when you least expect it.
That's right.
Right? The communication doesn't come because you demand communication. You have to really open yourself and be receptive. Mm-hmm. So what IADC basically does, and I'm short-circuiting things here a little bit for time, but IADC, what it does is it brings down the heaviness of the grief. Okay, it diminishes the heaviness of the grief. It resolves to some degree, if not entirely, the traumatic aspects of the grief, so that you can think about and reflect upon what happened without it causing that tremendous plunge into sadness and despair. So what it really focuses on is resolving, to whatever extent is possible, the sadness that is at the core of grief. Because at the core of grief, if you think about it, people feel, grief is a complex emotion. There's anger, there's guilt, there's regret, there's a lot of cognition that goes into grief, right? What we do in IADC, and by the way, what happened was I was treated with IADC first, Vial. I had an ADC with my daughter, and then I became a practitioner. I was trained as a practitioner, and that's what I share with my audiences. And so it to some degree, to whatever degree is possible, resolves the deep sadness associated with grief and opens us up. There's a certain peace that comes when you're able to bring that sadness down to a manageable level, if not to a zero. We call it a zero. Wow. And it resolves it to some degree so that you become more peaceful and you become more open. And that's when the ADC can occur.
Wow.
So something about resolving that deep heaviness of grief. And Al even said to me, Al trained me as well as, he treated me, then he trained me. And he said that meditation really helps. Meditators are more likely, I've mentioned this before, meditators are more likely to experience an ADC. And my guess is, I think I've also heard this from several mediums, and some of the mediums do teach meditation. They do just very basic meditation techniques. And I always say this too, I don't want to be a meditation Nazi, because I fully recognize the difficulty of meditating, but it is a very good practice, both for mental health and spiritual health.
Yeah, and brain health. I mean, they measure the brain waves on monks and their states, and they find they're constantly in a deeper brainwave state, which again, brain health is mental health. I firmly believe in a way.
That's right.
And what I love about IADC is it's congruent with the foundation, where it doesn't bypass the human part. It goes there. It allows you to understand that what you feel, you can heal. But then from going to the human, you're able to really find the spiritual through the depths of the darkness of the human experience. In the grief, you could find it much like a near-death experience, where you have this, for my case, pure suffocation and pure abyss type feeling. From going there, you see an eternal light, much like the stars at night and darkness that is presented. You could pierce the darkness and see the light. So I think that is certainly beautiful. Well, Dr. Mo, you have really shared so much pivotal information here, heartfelt, grounded, wise, groundbreaking as well. And so I'm so glad, obviously, towards the end that we got into this. EMDR, I know, was developed around 20 years ago, but now it's just booming. So I've been dying to have a guest to discuss this, because I know how pivotal it is for clients to understand. Now, for people who do want to get in touch with you, I don't know if you have availability for EMDR sessions, or just for people to have a question, or where's the best way to find you these days?
So I do have a website. I apologize that I may not have included that in my bio, but it's Therese Okay, so one word, Mo Therese, so MOTHERESE, Hannah, HANNAH, all one word, PhD.com. All right, that's my website, and it has my contact information if people are interested in reaching out to me. It has my email address, probably even has my cell phone number. Okay, which obviously I'm willing to share. So I'm open to interacting with your audience. This has been a wonderful experience, and congratulations on all the great work, Jake, that you do, and how much you move people and uplift them with your experiences as well.
My God, thank you. And I always give my guests the mic, either to drop or to say one last word. And my sentiments go the same to you. I'm just so inspired and proud of the work that you do and how impactful you are to people. Is there one last message that's coming to your mind, or you feel at this time that you were able to state whatever needed to be stated, as kind of like the New York Times says, in a way, all the news that's fit to print, right?
Well, I would just say one more thing, and it's one of the things I say in the presentations I give at the grief retreat, and that is that you can survive, and not only survive, you can thrive. What you believe, you can achieve. Okay, I know these are all standard fare that people have heard before, but I discovered that that's absolutely true. If you believe that you can not only survive, but thrive after a loss like this, indeed you can. Believe in yourself, believe in spirit.
And you walk the talk, and you're that a living embodiment of that sentiment. So it is certainly a possible reality. Dr. Mohana, thank you for your time. You're welcome on any time back here in the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. And I am just so honored to be a lucky guy that has crossed paths with you. And I think anyone considers themselves very fortunate to know you and to be impacted by your groundbreaking work and story of transformation.
Thank you so much, Jake. Okay, it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Well, that was a wonderful interview with Dr. Mohana, her experience professionally and her challenges that she's able to find resilience from really shine throughout the course of this conversation. And I know so many of you took inspiration and tidbits and tools that you can incorporate on your own grief and personal journeys, both from the mental health perspective and from the spiritual. So we thank Dr. Mohana for being an incredible and dynamic guest here on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode here on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder.